Hi, everybody. This is Empowering Democracy. I'm your host, Joe Firestone, and the topic of this screen is Ryan Grimm slash AOC interview. What we're going to do is go through the transcript of the interview, and I'm going to analyze and comment on it, and you'll be able to comment on it as well in the in the comments. Sorry. Okay, so we do have two comments. Hello, everyone, says around the world with Brandy and D. And D says, D here. Hi, D. Thank you for coming. Okay. Ryan Grimm and AOC did an interview. And hi, D from Facebook. Hi, D from YouTube. And The Intercept published the transcript of the interview. So I want to go over the transcript with you and comment on it, analyze it. Some of you may be thinking, well, Ryan Grimm, he's only out for himself, and AOC has caved all kinds of times, so she must only be out for herself. And why do we want to listen to them? Why do we want to hear what they have to say? Well, I suppose we want to because AOC is a congresswoman and we'd like to know what she's thinking about. And we know we have to take it with a grain of salt, but it is perhaps still something that we ought to analyze and pay attention to. I think AOC is going to have a long career. She'll be with us for a long time. She's going to have some power, in Congress. And maybe if she gets enough people who think in a similar way to the way she used to think, that maybe she will do some things for us at some point in her career. So I think it's worth paying attention. It's worth seeing and understanding how she thinks. And so here it is. I am going to share the screen and pick up the piece in The Intercept. Which records the transcript. The headline of this piece is AOC, the New York State Democratic Party's corruption may have cost Democrats the House. I'll bet there are a lot of things that have cost them the House because there were so many mistakes they made that I'm sure lots of things cost them the House. But what AOC is pointing to may indeed be one of the things that have cost them the House. So, This article comes under the byline of Ryan Grimm. It was done November 9th, 2022, just after the election. 6 days have passed since that time, of course. And there's AOC. Departs in a car after campaigning with New York Governor Kathy Hochul on November 8th, 2022 in New York City. On Wednesday, that was last Wednesday, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez called for the head of the New York State Democratic Party to resign in the wake of the catastrophic performance by Democrats in the state in the midterms, an underperformance so stark that it may make the difference in control of the House of Representatives, and by extension, the party's ability to enact its legislative agenda. Following Joe Biden's press conference Wednesday afternoon, Ocasio-Cortez spoke with The Intercept to elaborate on her critique of the state party and discuss the role of abortion and the youth vote in the midterms, Ukraine, and also the political distinction between unemployment and inflation. Okay, an unedited, except for ums and such, transcript of part 1 of the Q&A is below. Part 2, on the evolution of the left and her relation to it, is here. I don't know if we'll cover part 2 today. Looks like part 1 is going to be enough, at least for today. But anyway, here is Ryan Grimm. What did you make of Biden's press conference? And AOC replies, well, I was able to catch the beginning of it. I think most of it, but I think it was smart for him to come out right away and to really continue and formalize what was already emerging as the narrative, which is that this was, despite Republicans potentially taking back the House by a very slim margin, to really cement this as a Democratic victory and not a Republican one. Well, I guess I have to comment on that by saying there are many commentators who have said that this might have been a victory of sorts for the Democrats, but the contest for the House was not a victory for the Democrats because the Republicans, after all, won, okay, and not the Democrats. Going on, I think it was smart to do that. And I think it was quite notable that he mentioned young people and the climate crisis and youth turnout. I think it was just a smart thing to do in order to frame overall some of what we saw. In other words, to frame things in a way to create a particular narrative that she wants us to think about things in terms of. Ryan Grimm says, because of that big polling miss, it makes it easier for him to do that. But I'm curious if you think Democrats could have done better. What could they have done differently to make it an even better night? So Ryan reframes it with that particular question and gets the information he wants to get. AOC says, or at least tries to get the information that he wants to get. AOC says, well, New York, I think, is the glaring aberration in what I see in this map. Some people also think Florida was an aberration in that map, but okay. I have a front row seat to what was going on here, so I think it's natural for me to gravitate towards that. But I think even nationally, what happened in New York really bucks a lot of the trends in what we saw nationwide. I think that a lot of these races were much more uphill than what we saw in other places. I think in New York, the way that those campaigns were run were different than the way a lot of winning campaigns across the country were run. And I think the role of the state party had very strong national implications. If Democrats do not hang on to the House, I think that responsibility falls squarely in New York State. And so I think we definitely could have done better there. And I think that that's kind of like the glaring hole in where we did not perform as strongly as other areas in the map did. And Ryan asks, what were those key differences you think between the way they were run in New York, okay, and elsewhere? AOC says, I think policing was a big one. I think the choice among certain Democrats to validate the Republican narratives and amplify them on crime and policing, running ads on it, validating these narratives actually end up hurting them much more than a different approach. I think that what we saw in other races was that they were able to really effectively center either their narratives and the narratives they wanted to run with, whether it was abortion rights, whether it was democracy, whether it was, other key and top priorities. She continues, I think Democrats in New York, they did a couple of things. They ran ads around that were explicitly very anti defund, which only served to reinvoke the frame about defunding the police and only served to really reinforce what Republicans were saying. If we're going to talk about public safety, you don't talk about it in the frame of invoking defund or anti defund. You really talk about it in the frame of what we've done on gun violence, what we've done to pass the first gun reform bill in 30 years. Our alternatives are actually effective electorally without having to lean into Republican narratives. So I think that was one prime uh, uh, um, 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 mistake. And I think another prime mistake is that in New York State, I think that Cuomo may be gone, but his entire infrastructure, much of his infrastructure, and much of the political machinery that he put in place is still there. This is a machinery that is disorganized. It is sycophantic. It relies on lobbyists and big money, and it really undercuts the ability for there to be affirming grassroots and state level organizing across the state. And so when that languishes and there's very little organizing happening, yeah, I mean, basically, you're leaving a void for Republicans to walk into. So I actually think a lot of these Republican games aren't necessarily as strong as they seem. I think it's really from an absence. And it's a testament to the corruption that has been allowed to continue in the New York State Democratic Party. We saw that with India Walton. We saw loud and clear that there were a lot of canaries in the coal mine from the state ballot initiative. I mean, Jay Jacobs, the New York State Democratic Committee chair, Republicans put millions of dollars into defeating the redistricting ballot last year that would have actually protected the map, that would have put us ahead. And so I really believe that we would have won Democratic seats, potentially gained Democratic seats in New York State. But Republicans put millions of dollars against this ballot measure. They organized against it, and the New York State Democratic Party didn't drop $1 in making sure we got this thing passed. And this was in an off-year election. This was in an off-year election. This was in 2021. We could have done this. And the fact that that happened and there was still no implication for the state party and for the leadership of the state party, a lot of this was really about these calcified political machines being asleep at the wheel and there being a complete lack of desire to hold any of it accountable. Ryan says, and you called for Jay Jacobs to resign. What leverage do you and other progressives in the state have to make that happen? Is there anything being done organizationally to push that? What kind of structure would you see replacing the structure of the former Cuomo folks? Cuomo folks, huh? AOC replied, well, I think right now the New York State Democratic Party, the way that it is currently structured, is very reliant on the governor. I think that between Cuomo resigning late last year, Kathy Hochul then very unexpectedly taking the gubernatorial seat, then immediately dealing with a natural disaster, having to contend with a potential primary, and then a general. I don't really think that there's been as much breathing room to address that issue in that whole environment. But it's very clear that the New York State Democratic Party was designed under Cuomo to be very reliant on the governor's seat. The governor very much determines who the state party chair is. And I think that given how progressives really organized and helped to deliver that margin, I think that there is very much is room for a conversation to be held here about how we can restructure how the party is selected and established in perhaps a more decentralized way, or perhaps in a more democratic way that is more representative of communities and more encouraging of engagement across the state and less meddling, to be frank. Because these little, I think this says, because these little cuts really do build up. I wonder if that should have been these little cults really do build up. I don't know. Whether it was the failure on the ballot initiative, whether it was the refusal to recognize and respect when progressive candidates do win Democratic nominations outright, that the party doesn't work against its own particular nominees, which is what happened at Buffalo. I can't say I've been in Congress for 4 years. I've never had a conversation with the New York State Democratic Party chair ever. In fact, he's done nothing but attack progressive Democrats all across the state. What he has done is created an environment where the only quote unquote or the main quote unquote legitimate Democratic candidates worthy of support are those who fight both progressives and Republicans, which is clearly not a winning strategy, especially not in the state of New York. And so when he has invested so much energy into demoralizing the grassroots and making sure that a lot of this grassroots energy gets busted up all across the state, of course we're going to see these margins swing towards Republicans. So I think there really is something to be said here about a change in leadership and a change in structure of the state party, because this was really, when in 2018, when Cuomo was running against Cynthia Nixon, the state convention, first of all, didn't even invite really any progressives that were there, even after I won my primary. But beyond that, it voted to endorse Cuomo by a margin of something like 97%, which is nowhere near what the primary was. It was like a banana republic. And so it really just solely exists to just reaffirm the image of the governor, as opposed to actually investing in infrastructure that promotes democratic organizing. And then she says, okay, a lot of it is also driven by big money. And both the real estate and charter lobbies invested very heavily and have an enormous amount of influence in terms of what candidates get Democratic support in the state and which ones don't. But I think that even if there is no movement on the state party, I think their neglect has created enough space for there to be alternative structures to pop up, and some already have. Like if you look at NYPAN, the New York Progressive Action Network, and New York Pan. They were kind of an offshoot of the Our Revolution chapters that cropped up all across New York State, but they've actually retained their infrastructure and they've continued to remain active across the state. I think that New York Pan's organizing is very ripe to fill the role that the state Democratic Party has left vacant if we don't reform it in a more serious way. Ryan Grimm says, and one of the key players in that kind of real estate charter school state party apparatus that you talked about is House Democratic Caucus Chair Hakeem Jeffries. Do you think that there ought to be a reckoning for what his role is in this? Looks like he's going to make a bid for party leader if Pelosi steps down. What do you think the repercussions are of how New York played out for that? So AOC then now kind of withdraws a little bit from this. Well, I think what we should really do is I think there are quite a few figures who really affirmed and really pushed this playbook. And it's not even just this year. I think there has been a multi-year strategy to try. It's essentially been a campaign within the Democratic Party to undermine progressive politics and try to mischaracterize it as toxic. And I think a continued insistence on that is going to hurt the party because I think one of the big things that we learned last night is that not only is it not true, but that candidates who refuse to overcompensate and overly tack right were actually rewarded for sticking to their values and while doing their best to represent their communities. I personally do think that there should be a political cost to being heavily backed by big money. That, to me, is just the primary concern. And regardless of who it is in this discussion about generational change in the Democratic Party, I think we also need to be looking at donor bases. So, of course, I loved that particular paragraph. I personally do think there should be a political cost to being heavily backed by big money. That, to me, is just the primary concern. Me too, of course, as you all know. And regardless of who it is in this discussion about generational change in the Democratic Party, I think we also need to be looking at the donor basis. I'm not sure I know what that means, unless what she's saying is, well, maybe we should take our money from some of the big donors, but not from others of the big donors. We should be particular. Maybe she's saying that. And we shouldn't be shifting in a direction where the party or our party leadership becomes even more dependent on large donors and corporate backers, not less dependent, especially in a time when more Democrats are being elected independent of that and where the infrastructure for small dollar fundraising has only grown and become more vibrant. So I do hope that there really is reflection on some of the strategies that went awry in New York and how that was different from other places in the country. And I do hope that there is a reflection on being outwardly antagonistic towards a very enthused but progressive base, especially one in which young people delivered these wins. If you look at the difference between Tim Ryan and John Fetterman as races, some of the preliminary data is suggesting that they had the same turnout in almost every demographic except for young people. And as we know, young people skew way progressive within the party. So when you outwardly antagonize and outwardly seek to belittle and distance oneself from our progressive values, you demoralize your base. I think there's going to be a lot more of that analysis as more data rolls in. But it's not to say that everybody has to be holding the same line on progressive causes dependent on their community. But it doesn't. I do think this is a signal that being outwardly antagonistic, including trying to defeat the candidates who are progressive, trying to demoralize those bases is not healthy for the prospect, okay, of Democratic gains. I think that was a little bit of a word salad, uh, but I think what she's saying is, okay, it's not healthy to try to defeat the party's progressive candidates. RG asks, the election did offer a clear mandate for abortion rights, not just the House and Senate races, but in every state it was on the ballot. Yeah, Kentucky, Montana, Michigan, California, Vermont, the pro choice side won. So, what do you think Democrats can do with that mandate? Just saying, like, I'm going to vote again and vote harder in 2024 can't really be all there is. What should Biden do? What should Congress do with this new mandate? AOC said, depending on how slim this margin is, if Democrats are somehow able to eke this out with a 1 or 2 seat, a similar margin that we've had, I think we really need to go all out. We need to codify Roe v. Wade. If we're able to pick up our Senate margin, then we deliver on the things that we weren't able to deliver before. I think we try again on a $15 an hour minimum wage. I think we codify um, uh, uh, codify Roe v. Wade. I think we go for the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. I think we go all out on the litany of legislation that was stalled by Senators Joe Manchin and Kirsten Sinema. I think it's a very unique opportunity for us to do that in a very big way. Now, if the Republican caucus, uh, it ekes this out with a very narrow margin, which some folks are saying may be the case. Well, as I said earlier this afternoon, I certainly think it is the case. I think we take advantage of the disorganization of the Republican caucus. I do not believe Kevin McCarthy is a strong leader whatsoever, and I think we inflict a lot of pain on this. And either it becomes enough of a liability with them that they have to let something through because they're just getting killed on this issue, or they lose in 2 years. But on top of that, I also think the results of tonight or last night do give Biden actually a bit of a strengthened mandate, in that I believe that the message from the electorate was very clear. And I think that over the last 2 years, there had been a lot of self-doubt about how far to go. And I think we learned an economic lesson, which is that full employment is politically stronger than inflation. Just a comment here. We relearned that economic lesson if we're talking about the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party during the 1960s and the early 1970s always thought that full employment was politically stronger than inflation. It was only after the inflation that was caused by supply side factors that it was clear that the Democratic Party became more concerned about inflation than full employment. That was because of the punishment that was meted out by Paul Volcker, when he obviously prioritized inflation over full employment, which, by the way, was against the law by that time, because the Humphrey Hawkins bill had passed in 1979, and that bill stated flatly that there was a dual mandate: full employment, okay, and inflation, stopping inflation, that the Fed ought to follow. However, Volcker simply ignored, okay, the dual mandate, and he got away with it. Anyway, full employment is politically stronger than inflation, as opposed to when we were in the situation under Obama, where they tried the other tack and unemployment was punished much more severely. So I think we learned that economic message on employment. I think we learned the value of a very strong message on abortion, and whether that means Biden leaning into his pen a little bit more on executive orders and other tools at his disposal. I think that that's going to be very important, including the bully pulpit. I also think there was very strong implications around public safety that, like once and for all, after 2 years of the party insulting criminal justice organizers, also accusing them of sloganeering and trying to put out the conservatives on this issue, I actually do believe that there was a very clear measure. Okay, where was I on this one? And whether that means Biden leaning into his pen a little more on executive orders and other tools at his disposal, I think that's going to be very important, including the bully pulpit. I also think that there was very strong implications around public safety that, like once and for all, after 2 years of the party insulting criminal justice organizers, accusing them of sloganeering, and of trying to out the conservatives on this issue, I actually do believe that there was a very clear message here that the American electorate understands that the conversation about public safety extends beyond policing, that it also includes many other issues as well, because it's like what we say back home. We're able to communicate to our electorate. Are we here to talk about police or are we here to talk about bringing down crime? Because those are two different conversations. And I actually think that that's starting to sink in for people more, that this is not about rejecting safety, but this is about actually solving the problem and using evidence-based approaches to tackle this problem. I thought that was a very good statement on her part, a very good statement about framing things in relation to the public debate and trying to get people to focus more on the reality of things. So I don't think we run away from these things anymore. And I don't think we run away against healthcare writ large. I think depending on what happens with the House, if we have the opportunity, we also need to strike the Hyde Amendment as well. And I think that that's going to be increasingly important. And if we retain the Senate, and even if the House goes towards Republicans, given the very narrow margin of Republican victories, they too are also going to have to negotiate. They too are also going to have to compromise. And I think that they are in a much weaker position as a party, which means they have more to concede, not us. And we can stand in that confidence, in that power, okay, a little bit more. What I have to say about that is it's not clear that we need to look at the Republican Party as a monolith. We're going to have people who are more used to negotiating, who may approach negotiations that have to take place with some willingness to compromise. But there is the Freedom Caucus, and there's evidence that the Freedom Caucus was strengthened to some degree by these elections, and that may have brought some people into Congress, not as many as they'd hoped, but some new people into Congress who simply are unwilling to compromise and who uh, need to be taught, okay, to compromise. I think If Biden doesn't do something about the debt ceiling threat right now and do something about it during the lame duck, then if we run into the problem we expect in January and February with the Republicans pushing some debt ceiling crisis and then having this group on the right wing of the Republican Party say, we don't care if the federal government falls down. We are not going to compromise. We get what we want. In other words, the Lauren Boberts of the world, who unfortunately looks like she's going to win, but she'll be supplemented by a number of others who are going to say, we don't care if the federal government shuts down. We don't care if people are hurt. We think the national debt is too large and we're against Social Security and Medicare and these other things, and we want to cut them. We think they hurt us as a nation. We shouldn't have this. There are people like that who will not compromise. And depending on their strength as a group inside of the Republican Party, it's going to be necessary for Republicans to stop those people, to stop them from controlling what the whole federal government can do and does during the next 2 years. So that crisis is shaping up. I think the Democrats need to realize that there are more radicals on the right wing coming in from the other side, and that it's necessary for the Democrats to protect us and protect themselves by eliminating the debt limit as a weakness that causes trouble that is necessary for the Democrats to give way on. I think that has to happen. Anyway, Ryan Grimm says, picking up on that point a bit, when you're talking about inflicting pain on McCarthy or on the Republicans, are you thinking discharge petition on Roe? Because you'll probably have at least 210 members who will sign a discharge petition. AOC says, yeah, I think discharge petition is an excellent vehicle. I do think that using rules, in other words, using rules against the Republicans, is going to be quite important. I know that that's going to be subject to negotiation within the Republican caucus as well. This is something that they're already started to use as a lever. And so part of me doesn't want to. I want to make sure that we're navigating this carefully. Because like motions to recommit, once one party kind of messes with it, it could create a precedent. So I would be concerned if they did something like try to blow up the process of discharge petitions, because it's such an essential part of our procedures. And they use them as well. They use discharge petitions as well. They're not always successful, but it is a mechanism. Here, the radical right wing may not want to mess with the process of discharge petitions, because they can use the discharge petitions as well to get some crazy bills that they want people to stand up on to the floor. I know from our point of view, those bills are going to be crazy, but they will use that process in order to force everybody in the Republican Party to be on record about certain things that differ from their own very radical views. They will use those petitions to charge up their base. And Ryan Grimm says, speaking of discharge petitions, on the stock trading ban, you had pushed a discharge petition and then withdrew it after Pelosi promised to bring that to the floor. I'm sure you saw Virginia Representative Elaine Luria looks like Iowa Representative Cindy Axne is trailing. Both of them were kind of like public defenders of congressional stock trading and just got hammered for it during their campaigns. Yeah, Cindy Axne got beat, and Elaine Luria also got beat because they were defending congressional stock trading. Uh, and Ryan Grimm then continues, do you think it was a mistake to withdraw that? And where is that fight now? AOC kind of dodges a little bit and says, I'm trying to remember when this happened. I believe it was early summer when this happened. And so when I filed a discharge petition for me, I felt like it was important to file it because it felt clear to me that leadership was trying to do, just felt clear to me that there was just a lot of slow walking around this. And I felt like there was just kind of hope that this was just kind of a hope that this was just going to try to disappear into the background. I just filed my discharge petition in an attempt to get this thing going again. And as far as that happened, it was successful. We're able to get leadership to move on this. So AOC is saying that she used the process to force the leadership to try to get a vote on this. People like Cindy Axne, okay, and Elaine Luria did not want a vote on this because they thought that if they voted their principles, which is that Congresspeople should be able to stock trade, that would hurt them, okay, in their races. Now, I don't know whether it hurt them or it didn't hurt them, but I do know both of them lost, and that might have become an issue in their campaigns. So Ryan Grimm is asking AOC whether, but she's sorry about that, and her response is, well, it was successful. We needed a floor vote on that, and we were able to get the leadership to move on this because I filed the discharge petition. She goes on, I think that there were some of these negotiations that were happening in good faith. And not only when we filed the discharge petition, because the thing is, that petition was filed for my bill with Representatives Joe Neguse, okay, and Raja Krishnamurti. But we do have a broad coalition of people who support the concept in general, but there are many different kinds of proposals that are out there. So I had concerns that it wouldn't be successful without the other folks in that coalition on board, because we really needed like everybody to sign this thing in order for us to get to this vote. So I think that just what the discharge petition was successful in was getting leadership to take this seriously, to get a little momentum for it. And I also think it was helpful in bringing this coalition together. We were able to do that press conference, but not only that, we we're also able to come together and really start to negotiate much more seriously on what a piece of compromise legislation among all of us with different proposals would look like. We actually came to that in early fall. That was when leadership announced their bill, frankly, without consultation with anybody in the coalition. And that was very shortly before we recessed it. It was just like a week or two before we recessed. So whether it was a mistake or not to withdraw it, I'm not sure. I think there were definitely some positives to it, and I certainly reserve my right to do it again because I do think there's a point where we are running out of the clock here and we need to get this thing done. It will not happen under a Republican Congress, that's for sure. Ryan Grimm says, and Democrats also hammered progressives for that. Congressional Progressive Caucus letter encouraging the pursuit of negotiations to end the war in Ukraine, saying that it was like doing it right before the election would end up hurting Democrats. That letter, as you know, that was retracted. You never commented on that, on whether you still stood by it, and you and other progressives have been criticized for not laying out your thinking on it. On kind of what the progressive position ought to be when it comes to this war. I don't know if you saw this, but Russia just announced it's withdrawing from Kherson. By the way, that is not what Russia just announced. What it just announced was that it was withdrawing from Kherson City and the parts of Kherson that were west of the Dnieper River. Uh, okay, Ryan states his opinion, which is a massive defeat for them. But so, why hasn't there been more of a progressive voice on a debate over war funding? Well, I'm of the school that their withdrawal from Kherson City and the ground in Kherson that was west of the river, uh, I don't consider it a massive defeat for them. They retreated for strategic reasons. I am sure they intend to come back when their expanded army is fully ready. And then we will see. But from my point of view, they conducted an orderly retreat. Very few people were killed. They took most of their equipment with them. They now have solidified a defense line on the eastern side of the river, making it very difficult for the Ukrainians to um, attack those positions which they have solidified. And I believe that they've got a strong foundation now from which to build a big offensive. But we will know in a few weeks. We will know in a few weeks what the truth of this is. But I don't consider this a massive defeat. And I think the people who think it was a massive defeat are spending propaganda so this war will go on for a longer period of time than it has to. But anyway, but in terms of the content of the letter, AOC says, like timing aside, in terms of the content of the letter, I believe that a lot of it is quite consistent with what we've also been hearing from former Obama administration officials, the Biden administration, and now even recently there have also been, I believe, some developments coming out of Ukraine indicating an openness to negotiate under certain preconditions. Yes, that has happened because Jake Sullivan went to Ukraine and had some long meetings with Zelensky, and the outcome of that was the statement by Zelensky that they were open to negotiations under certain preconditions. Of course, the preconditions were absolutely ridiculous. Okay, they're not preconditions the Russians could possibly agree to. So more of this has to be ironed out. But it seems to me what the progressives tried to do was the right thing in that situation. It was a move calculated to get things moving on the negotiations front, and that can potentially be very important. How serious the administration is when it comes to negotiations remains to be seen, but the visit by Jake Sullivan to Zelensky and the reported talks that he is having with his opposite number from Russia um, um, also suggest that what the progressives were asking for was not so unreasonable as at the time the administration was suggesting, and it may be the withdrawal of the letter by the progressives was due to the fact that the administration let them know that the administration had some activities going on in that particular direction, and that their letter was not welcome because those negotiations had to be secret. Uh, okay, what I believe about this is that the letter of the progressives was indicative of sentiment for negotiations developing in the country. And I believe both their letter and the administration new tack in relation to negotiations are both due to a recognition that there is a lot of force behind the idea that we ought to be negotiating among the people of this country. Anyway, to go on with AOC, I believe some developments coming out of Ukraine indicating an openness, to negotiate under certain preconditions, and I believe that progressives have always advocated to leaning on diplomatic solutions. We should continue to lean on that. I think the large asterisk is, well, Russia is Russia. How can we bring Russia to the table without compromising Ukrainian sovereignty and just core principles of self determination? But that is really what the landscape of diplomacy is about. And even when Obama was on Pod Save America, quote unquote, several weeks ago, he discussed about how at this present time, diplomatic relations are likely worse than they may have been almost at any point during the Cold War, which is a very dangerous place to be. And so the reaction to the publication of this letter, I think, continues to be a bit overblown. And I think that it's almost like people looking for a problem where there really, I don't think, is any intent for there to be one. I also think it's quite consistent with what we've been hearing from, frankly, the Biden administration, former Obama administration officials, and even certain Ukrainian officials. And now, when it comes to that recent development on Russia, I do believe that there's some skepticism that we're hearing from Ukrainian officials about whether that is the genuineness or authenticity of good faith that announcement was made. But I think there's something that we will soon see play. That I think that's something that we will soon see play out. I agree with her on that. We will soon play out, soon be able to see where the good faith is in all of the people now talking about actually having negotiations are. Rod Grimm says, back on that point about making some pain for Republicans on abortion rights, if you do end up losing those seats in New York, probably a lot of them are going to be uncomfortable with the Republican position and politically vulnerable around it. I think that was a very good point from Ryan Grimm. Yet they do feel pretty confident saying that they're against the Women's Health Protection Act because they caricature it as, you're killing babies right before birth. But WHPA, which is short is known as WIPA, does go beyond codifying Roe v. Wade. So where do you come down on the question of trying to get the codification of Roe into law versus holding out for the kind of maximalist type of WIPA legislation? AOC responds and says, well, I think when it comes to something like WIPA, I think that a lot of this is just about the messaging. And so Roe, I think in public imagination, I believe that what Roe really stands for and what people really see as Roe is a woman or person's ability to have bodily autonomy and make these decisions between them and their doctor. Mm-hmm. Okay, by the way, I think that's the core of that issue also for Lisa Theobald as well. Oaths. The doctors have oaths. Yes, and Bonnie says the doctors have oaths. Okay, and those oaths go to the question of they making decisions with their patients and not having any external interference from governmental authorities or from politics. And Republicans, where they try to go in against WIPA, is by trying to slice and dice and make these questions about 15 weeks or 20 weeks or 30 weeks. And I think for a very long time, people have kind of run away from that fight. I don't think we need to litigate the number of weeks. I think, if anything, in the aftermath of Roe, there have been an enormous amount of conversations about the enormous amount of circumstances in which this is not applying to this kind of myth of third trimester elective abortions where, like, there's nothing else that's wrong. I think when we try to, like, really bring this down and campaign on WIPA, I think we do ourselves a disservice. I think we can remain focused on the overall principle here, which is people should be able to make these decisions between themselves and their doctor. I mean, I know people have been in situations where they're in, like, late second, sometimes even early third trimester, and horrifying complications arise, and the procedure to save the mother's life is known as abortion, even though the fetus was not viable. And so, I think especially in places like Westchester County, we can make this an issue. We just need to actually make it an issue. And we need real organizing happening in communities like these. But I don't think we're at the place of concession on this, because I just don't think that we've tried. I don't think we've exhausted our options here by any means. I think this is a lot of good reasoning from AOC about this issue, Ryan Grimm says. And any thoughts of anybody in the progressive wing running for leadership? AOC says, I don't know, because there's still a lot of question marks that I don't know what a lot of these leadership races may look like. I still think there's a question about what's even going to happen in terms of transitions. Like, I don't think that any of that has really been made clear yet. That may also be a result of the fact that we don't know what the final tally is. I think that was, of course, uh, close to a week ago now, and we're still not sure what the final tally is. I think there are going to be different considerations where, if we end up eking this thing out with a one or two seat majority, which, by the way, is still theoretically possible even today, but doesn't look like a probable outcome. Uh, and then she says, not too dissimilar from the 3 or 4 seat majority that we had dealt with. I think people are going to prioritize different characteristics in leadership. I think that the value and the ability to hold this caucus together and organize it, that's a Herculean feat for us to be able to pass the legislation that we did with the margins that we had. It's really quite unbelievable. So if we are in the majority again with that very small margin, I think there's going to be a focus on making sure that we have someone that can really retain that ability. But if we're the minority, I think people may prioritize different kinds of skill sets to navigating being an opposition party in a minority. And so I'm not too sure yet. I think all these races being called are going to have an impact on what direction people go in and whether they decide to run for things or not as well. Okay. I think that's a very wise comment, but I also think that what AOC may be hinting at here is that if the Democrats do end up with a very small margin, then they're going to be very focused on having a candidate for the speakership, okay, who is able to organize the caucus well and hold the caucus together. And I think she's further hinting that perhaps the only one inside of the Democratic Party who can hold the caucus together and organize it with a few seat margin, that may be Nancy Pelosi. Now, I'm not too sure about that, but I have the feeling that a lot of the progressives inside of the party do give Nancy Pelosi credit for being able to hold the caucus together, okay, and organize it. and that they're not sure that anybody else can do that who would have a chance to be selected as the speaker. Well, now she may not be wrong on this, but I would point out, in opposition to the idea that there's only one person, that that person was in part responsible for a number of very bad things happening during the last term. First of all, that person did not act quickly enough after the January 6th event and let people go home. Let people go home and take a break before coming together again to consider the January 6th event. When they were allowed to go home, everybody had been shaken by this event. Lots of Republicans were shaken by that event. And they were in prime condition to be willing to go further than they were when they had time to cool off and say, oh, well, maybe this really wasn't so bad. And that resulted in their not taking immediate action against Trump. And that was very damaging, and that was because Pelosi failed to act right at the moment to pull the Democrats together and to get the Republicans behind her, some Republicans with the proper arguments, okay, behind her. We let things cool off, and we let people get behind that Stop the Steal movement. In my view, that was bad leadership. Then there was the American Rescue Plan. It passed the House with $15 an hour in it. Passed the House with $15 an hour in it. Then it went to the Senate, and Schumer took the $15 an hour out of the bill. The House bill never got to the floor, so there was no vote on the House bill. Bernie Sanders was forced into the position. That's probably too strong to say, because Bernie Sanders bears some responsibility for this too. But he got put into a position in part because of his own failure to act aggressively. He was put into a position where he had to do an amendment to the American Rescue Plan to get the $15 an hour back in. That, my friends, was very, very bad. Nancy Pelosi and the House needed a vote on the American Rescue Plan. Thank you, Bonnie. They needed a vote on the American Rescue Plan just as the House passed it out. And she could have forced that to happen. Because when Chuck Schumer sent back the bill out of the Senate, passed it out of the Senate, without the $15 per hour in it, she could have simply said, sorry, folks, we can't accept this in the House. Our whole caucus in the House is solidly behind the $15 an hour. We need this vote that we passed, this bill that we passed, to get a floor vote in the Senate before any changes are made. So, we are sending your bill back with a defeat, and we are resending our original legislation back to you. If you want to have a conference on it, then that's fine. We can have a formal conference on it. But until you agree to a conference The only bill you're getting from us is the American Rescue Plan. And she could have said that loudly and clearly to Biden, too. And in private, she could have said to Biden, Mr. President, I don't give a crap about your uh, your parliamentarian in the Senate. The Senate parliamentarian has no authority over the House. And she has no authority over the Senate either. She's a civil servant. She's an advisor. If she doesn't like the $15 an hour in this bill, it's too bad. I expect you to go along with me and to go along with the with the House and to go along with the majority of the Senate party that want the $15 an hour in the bill. And until I get that, this American Rescue Plan is not going to pass. I think that's what she should have said to all concerned. She should have insisted on it, and it would have been passed out of the Senate. It would have been passed out of the Senate because Joe Biden would have put the screws on Manchin and Sinema from day one. And that whole session might have been different. The infrastructure plan is another area. She needed to hold steady. She said she was going to back the infrastructure plan in the two parts that it was written in. She was guaranteeing that the part with all the benefits for people and with the benefits for the climate was going to get a floor vote. And then she caved. And she got Jayapal to cave. And the child tax credit was one of the victims of her caving. And the perception that Biden was a weak sister was one of the perceptions of her caving, because he guaranteed it too. Having her as the Speaker of the House during during this session just passed was costly, very costly to the priorities of the people. I know certain bills were passed out. I know a little something was done. But there is no way the child tax credit should not have been made permanent. It shouldn't even have been an issue. If the American Rescue Plan had been written right, it wouldn't have been temporary at all. So I don't think Nancy Pelosi's performance as Speaker was very good during these last 2 years. I think it was damaging. It was damaging to the perception of the Democratic Party as doing things for people. Here's a note from Bonnie. Bonnie says wages should be about $20. Wages should be a living wage in every corner of the United States, whatever that living wage is. There should be no fixed number. There should be a fixed number for the lowest cost area in the United States that constitutes a living wage for that area. Let's assume that's $15 an hour. Then that gets cost adjusted using the CPI for every district in the United States. By the time you get to New York and to Alaska, the damn wage would probably be $35 an hour. And that would be just fine. But that's what should have been passed out. But first things first. First things first. Let's get the damn $15 an hour done, and then let's go for what really should be the case. So, anyway, back to AOC. I think people are going to prioritize different characteristics in leadership. I think the value and ability to hold the caucus together, organize it, that's a Herculean feat for us to be able to pass the legislation that we did with the margins that we had. It is really quite unbelievable. And so, if we are in the majority again with that very small margin, I think there's going to be a focus on making sure we have someone that can really retain that ability. I think there are a few people who can retain that particular ability. I think Debbie Dingell can do it. And I'd much rather try hard than go again with Pelosi, given all the mistakes she will make. I didn't even mention the trip to Taiwan. That trip to Taiwan was crazy. It was a crazy gamble. And for what? I can't get it out of my head that she took the trip to Taiwan for the purpose of shoring up investments that she and her husband had made. Anyway, I digress. Going on with what AOC said again, but if we're the minority, I think people may prioritize different kinds of skill sets to navigating being an opposition party in the minority. And so I'm not too sure yet. I think all these races being called are going to have an impact on what direction people go in and whether they decide to run for things or not as well. I think she's right about that. But I don't agree with the implication here that the person to select is going to be Nancy Pelosi because she's so good, okay, at organization. I think we've got to get rid of her. We've got to get rid of her austerity. We've got to get rid of her leadership team, who was so damaging in the politics of it. I mean, Jim Clyburn, goodbye. Okay. I didn't intend to go on for this long. I've been on for about an hour and 15 minutes. It's probably time for me to go, but I will take a look at your comments. And Jeff says, no way of knowing what the truth is about AOC, but we do know for a fact that we're not being told it. And once again, for the people in the cheap seats, the country's not even a democracy. So how in the hell are a handful of members of Congress who don't take dirty money more powerful and responsible for everything bad than hundreds of people who are backed by billionaires? I don't know, Jeff. That's a big puzzle to me. I'm glad you took this opportunity to make that comment. Kay said, trying to follow the missile hit in Poland, too. 2 killed in Poland. Jesus, what the hell was that about? Sandy said, oh no. Kay said, yes. Kay said, AOC is right. Kay says, Article 4 is happening now in Poland. Big meeting by NATO. Hi, Kay and Dolores and Sandy. That's a setup. That's a setup. Ick is right, Sandy. I'll say so. Hi, Lana. Nancy needs to go. Yes, Sandy. She's out of touch with the people. Sandy says she doesn't care as long as her freezer is full of designer ice cream. All is well. Sandy says yes. It should go by cost of living. Nancy, only worried about Nancy. Lana says hi, Sandy and Kay and Steve and Dolores. Hi, Lana. And Lana says hashtag no more Pelosi. Hashtag replace Pelosi January 3rd. Yes, Lana. Sandy says ditto, no more Pelosi. So those were the comments. Thank you for all those comments. it's time for me to go get some dinner, and I'll see you at 9 p.m. What I'm going to talk about at 9 p.m. is, what the hell is the title of that? I'll be talking about the role of money in politics again, specifically with reference to the 2022 midterms. I'll be talking about just how much money was spent, how ridiculous it was, and the damage that it did. Don't for a moment think that because some races were won in spite of the money, that that huge amount of money didn't have a giant and very negative effect on the campaign. It certainly did, and I'll be making that clear later, okay, at 9 p.m. So please do come to the 9 p.m. show. I'm ending the broadcast now. Sandy says, ditto, no more Pelosi, and says, thank you, Joe and Bonnie and everyone. Thank you for coming, Sandy. It's great to see you here. It's great to see you all. See you later at 9.